Dad, check your laptop. The words hit like a dropped beam. They arrived as a ping that shattered the quiet in my home office and landed on the screen like a small, brutal truth. I was hunched over a set of elevation drawings, my left hand ink stained from technical pen and my right hand stained with cedar shavings from the model I'd been carving all week, and the house smelled like the shop at dusk, cedar and the sour sweetness of fresh adhesive. I looked up and there was Maya in the doorway, 14 and steadier than I felt, eyes too calm for the hour. The room shrunk around those four words. My hands moved before my head did. They were the same hands that had traced the curve of our kitchen island on a Saturday 13 years ago, the same hands that had smoothed my wife's veil while we laughed and everyone said forever. I opened my laptop because I obeyed a child. The desktop sat ordinary and cruel, a window already open, a folder named important, its icon innocent and white against the blue. Inside it was a stack of files that read like a deliberate betrayal, like someone had curated a small museum of treachery. There were dozens of screenshots, message threads with timestamps that stitched together months of secrecy, nights and lunch hours and mornings when our home should have been honest. Texts between Brittany and Cole Matthews, little private jokes, then plans, then the casual cruelty of people calibrating a parallel life. The dates rolled from last October through to this spring. Strings of hearts, hotel emojis, a shorthand of names that used to mean nothing to me and now meant everything. Layered in the folder were bank screenshots, raw and unblurred. Withdrawals from Maya's trust account in 6 deposits, each for $6,800, totaling $40,800, wired in ways that read like a pattern rather than a mistake. I know numbers the way other people know faces. I designed structures that have to stand, so the arithmetic hit me like gravity. There were charges from boutique shops, a camouflage jacket from some Italian label, a handbag with a price that made me look twice, and there were receipts for weekend hotels 30 minutes away, charges at a coastal inn, a private consultation that cleared enough to make our daughter's college savings look paper-thin. Little things at first glance. A spa voucher, a brunch receipt for two, a car service charge linked to a name that wasn't ours. The details were filthy with intimacy because they were paid for out of the account set up for her music lessons and summer camp. Maya walked in like she'd rehearsed this exact entrance. She crossed to the desk without fidgeting and set a small phone down on the table, face up. She didn't need to explain the tech, she said, plain as a ledger entry. I installed monitoring on Mom's phone when she started coming home late. It felt wrong. Her voice held no accusation, only facts. She told me she'd been taking screenshots for months, timing them into folders by date, and that she'd put them on my laptop because she trusted me to do something right with them. I wanted to cradle her like a broken thing, but I held myself steady because the evidence needed a mind more than a hand. My disbelief felt like a physical thing, a cold tightening under my ribs, the kind of panic that cleaves you into small, useful pieces. My brain kept playing old footage in the wrong order, Brittany's smile in the church light, our vows, Maya's sticky hands at the reception table. Those memories were not lies, they were just suddenly porous, a tissue-thin skin over a much larger wound. This wasn't a private quarrel between two adults with grievances. This was theft. This was money taken from a child who saved crayon drawings of college dorms and a list of the bands she wanted to see. I asked Maya why she didn't say anything sooner and she shrugged like the answer was obvious. Because I wanted proof, she said. Because I didn't want you to shout or throw stuff, I wanted something that would matter. There was a maturity in that felt like a debt. She had been the architect of her own protection, younger than most clients who trusted me with their houses and more precise than the accountants I once respected. I closed the laptop slowly, not out of fear of what else might be there, but to make a decision about tone. I looked at my daughter and made a promise that landed in the room like a beam. I told her we would not act rashly. We would gather everything, catalog every file, and then decide how to move forward in a way that protected her and put everything on a legal, unassailable track. The words left my mouth like steel, but inside I felt a pressure building, not fury for show, but a careful, cold readiness. The promise was small and exact. We will be surgical, we will be legal, and we will not let this become a humiliation for our girl. Then I said aloud what I had known in that frozen instant. This was not about getting even, it was about stopping theft, about building something that could not be stolen again. Maya's jaw tightened in agreement, and for the first time since I'd opened that folder, movement replaced paralysis. We had proof, and proof was a tool. We would use it. The plan, urgent, quiet, and uncompromising, settled over us like night itself. There was no turning back now. The house kept its routine like armor. I moved through it slow and precise, chopping vegetables with the same measured rhythm I used to draw beam lines. I set a place for 3 because habit is a stubborn thing, because a table set feels like order, because Maya still believed we were an ordinary family even if our bones were splintering. The kitchen light threw a warm pool onto the counter. Cedar dust drifted in from my office and the kettle hummed like a patient thing. At 7:00 p.m. the front door clicked, and Brittany came in with 2 shopping bags and a rehearsed apology practiced so long it had lost its edges. She hung her coat, smelled faintly of perfume and someone's aftershave, and said, "Before anything else, I'm done playing house." The sentence was small and sharp, a shard of glass in polite phrasing, and it told me everything I needed to know about where she'd been living for months. Her voice had that clinical, practiced tone people learn when they've rehearsed leaving a life rather than negotiating within it. She told me straight out that she wanted out, that she and Cole had been planning to leave, that they had arrangements backed up and timelines in place. Her eyes were trained not to ask for forgiveness, but to assert inevitability. My reaction was a measurement rather than a storm. I kept my voice flat, my hands steady, because rage would be a public tool and we did not need that. My mind, however, was cataloging behaviors the way I'd learned to catalog structural faults in buildings, small cracks that signaled a shifting foundation. Brittany's entitlement had always shown as little things. Nicknames that erased my history, offhand decisions about money that assumed compliance. She shifted our center of gravity without us noticing. And now the weight had dropped and left a vacancy I could trace back to late nights and private receipts. Maya sat at the table in her school uniform, book bag slumped on a chair back, pretending to read but listening like someone who had rehearsed not reacting. When Brittany left the room to take a call, Maya folded her hands and said to me quietly, "I took care of everything." She didn't expand, and that was deliberate. Her face didn't plead or look for reward. It was an adult's face put on a child's frame. I let her be silent and waited for the right moment to pry. Her restraint was both comforting and terrifying. Comforting because it meant she understood boundaries. Terrifying because it meant she had crossed into operating alone. After putting the kitchen into a state that could be photographed and not misread as chaos, we went into the office. We laid everything out like plans across a table, screenshots, file names, small bureaucratic things that were to me maps. There were email subject lines that read like small confessions, weekend plans, reservation confirmed, coastal suite, wire instructions, each with a date, each with a timestamp in military time. Photo files labeled IMG 20,250,412 220,456. JPG and IMG 20,250,203 JPG carried embedded timestamps that matched the message threads. Transaction IDs were stapled to everything. ACH 7,291,830,451, Trans 046582119, Bank Confirmation 800-81774332, withdrawal times at odd hours. The specificity stripped any plausible deniability. Maya slid a printed list across the desk that matched the laptop folders and said, "There's a file for every month. Receipts, payments, a running total." Her handwriting was neat, clinical. The running total at the bottom matched what I'd seen earlier, 6 withdrawals of $6,800 that added up to $40,800 taken from her trust fund in ways designed to look routine. We compared metadata, checked sender addresses, confirmed that a boutique charge on November 8 lined up with a hotel receipt 2 days later. The pattern was a straight line. I felt the old architecture urge in me, the one that wanted to shore up foundations and prevent collapse. Halfway through that quietly furious sorting, my phone buzzed. It was Jason Miller. He said he'd seen a social post, a tagged story with a coastal check. In that mentioned a name he recognized, an ambiguous caption, and a public audience that hadn't realized how incriminating a single geotag could be. He pulled up in 20 minutes, suit jacket already unbuttoned, face made of legal calm. He laid out his appraisal without melodrama. This is not the time for spectacle. Surgical restraint, documentation, and pressure through regulators and banks would do more than yelling at a liar. We talk strategy in plain sentences, the kind architects and lawyers use. Timeline, chain of custody, secure copies. Jason's eyes were steady and calculating, the same look he'd worn on better days at my wedding when he advised what would hold. By midnight, when Brittany snored in the guest room with the practiced obliviousness of someone convinced of their own control, I called Alan Pierce. Alan was what you hired when you needed someone to move quietly through the back alleys of money and influence. He answered on the second ring, voice low and effective, and within an hour I had him over to run a discrete asset trace. Alan listened, took notes, and then left with a promise that was calm and cold. They would find where the money went, who was enabling transfers, and they would make those paths visible to people who had far less tolerance for crooked reputations than Brittany or Cole imagined. I felt something settle in my chest then, an intention like a beam placed across a doorway. We would teach them consequences. not for the sake of cruelty, but because some betrayals needed to be structural failures corrected before they could spread. We sat around the kitchen table at midnight like conspirators who'd never wanted to be conspirators, maps spread between coffee cups and the glow of my laptop throwing lines across our faces. Jason laid out the legal moves with a lawyer's calm: immediate custody of evidence, certified copies, and a filing schedule that would make every step look routine. Alan, who smelled faintly of rain and strategy, drew a different map, where the money ran, which accounts got cut, and which shell companies skimmed fees into accounts no one expected. Maya had a stack of printed screenshots and a highlighted timeline that cut across months and patterns. The plan was simple and strict because simplicity is the only thing that survives stress. First, move Maya's trust into an untouchable vehicle within 48 hours, an irrevocable custodial trust held by a professional fiduciary at a trust company with a two-person signatory rule. We couldn't leave anything movable. Jason called the trust officer at First Harbor Trust before dawn. Alan confirmed wire rails and transfer windows, noting that banks take 48 hours to clear some international routing adjustments, but that a domestic AUK plus overnight check would give us the control we needed fast. We set the deadline: 2 days to move everything, no exceptions, no leaks. Second, preliminary notices to the banks. We informed the custodian bank in writing, attached certified copies of the screenshots and transaction IDs that match the withdrawals. ACH 7,291,830,451, trans 046582119, confirmation 881774332, and asked for holds and an internal audit. Those asks were legal and boring and therefore effective. Jason said bland things in letters because blandness is what freezes action. The banks would respond to procedure more readily than to righteous screaming. Third, identify the smoke. Alan had already traced funnels to a handful of corporate names: Crestmont LLC, Seabrook Holdings, and Harborlight Ventures, entities tied to Kohl's projects by filings, and a pattern of invoices that always routed through an intermediary firm. We built a list of potential shell companies connected to Kohl's flagship development, the Meridian at Pier 7, and planned a quiet, anonymous regulatory tip to the State Building Department pointing out permitting irregularities and safety sign-offs that looked too tidy. Alan wanted that tip submitted by noon tomorrow. Jason wanted it bundled with supporting emails and photo timestamps. We wanted enforcement curious and busy. Maya's role was surgical and small in outward motion but massive in effect. She set up monitoring alerts on Brittany's known accounts, created a spreadsheet of message timestamps and withdrawal dates, and compiled a folder of public-facing posts to be tagged where they would hurt: a lifestyle influencer who'd been gifted a coastal stay, an Instagram post from a boutique that tagged Kohl by name, a business page with geotagged photos from the Meridian's marketing. She identified the few accounts with the biggest immediate reach and flagged them: the project's Instagram with 42,000 followers, a local development reporter's handle, and a neighborhood forum where investors gossiped. Her fingers moved like a surgeon's. We agreed on anonymity for the first moves. Alan finished an asset tracing run and found a pattern. Payments flowed into Crestmont LLC, then split to a private consulting account, then vanished into a Cayman-style routing that had one complacent banker and a lot of smoke. Alan said we could choke the flow if we made the right people nod. Jason drafted the notices to regulators and banks. I signed and stamped copies for chain of custody. Maya printed a timeline that matched message threads to bank withdrawals down to the minute. The feeling in the room was clinical and cold, like checking a structure for stress points before removing a supporting wall. Kohl's arrogance leaked in a message the next afternoon while we were still moving files. His tone was thin and smooth. He wrote, "You're making a mistake digging around in things that don't belong to you. Walk away, Daniel, for your daughter." I answered with a note that sounded like defeat on the surface, crisp, neutral, and almost weary. "I'm sorry you feel that way. We'll handle this legally." The calm in my reply was a tool meant to misread him. I wanted him to think I was collapsing rather than building pressure. 2 days passed like a slow clock. Banks answered with form letters, regulators opened file numbers, and the chorus of social feeds shifted from ordinary bragging to small, pointed curiosity. Tagged stories that once meant nothing began to look like breadcrumbs. I watched the feeds and my daughter both, understanding in a new way that once the first domino fell, the rest would accelerate in ways we couldn't fully script. We had laid the foundation stones. Now we had to be patient enough to see the walls come down. The first inspectors came before dawn, boots on gravel and clipboards open while the site lights still hummed. I was in my study with plans stacked neatly on the shelf, coffee gone cold beside me, and the live industry feed on my laptop when the alerts started coming through. A stop work order posted on the Riverside site, a field inspector's note about improperly documented permits and untested load plans, and a terse city bulletin that made the headline of a local business thread within an hour. I watched the Meridian feed collapse into scrolling panic and felt the room compress into the narrow line between evidence and consequence. Maya texted me exactly 8 minutes after the first post appeared. They're panicking. The message sat on the screen like a small victory and a warning at once. It was the kind of blunt thing she would say, the same voice that had put the evidence on my laptop a week earlier. The stock ticker on my screen matched the tempo of her message. Matthew's development group opened lower and then slid hard as investors digested the stop work order and emailed regulators. By noon, the market showed a 19% drop intraday, a brutal swing for a company that prided itself on steady quarterly promises and coastal image. The number looked obscene on the chart, 19% in bright red, and I logged it against the timeline for later because everything needed to be measurable. Brittany's social feed started to crack like old plaster. Friends who had once liked every vacation photo began to pull free with small gestures that meant more than they thought, untagging a boutique post, removing a comment, disappearing from comment threads. The boutiques that had sold her pricey things, Marlowe & Co., Luna Atelier, and Isla Rue, each received audit notices in the afternoon. I watched a security camera clip sent anonymously to my inbox showing Brittany at a downtown cashier's window, card in hand, being politely refused because the charge had been flagged. Her face in that clip was small and stunned in a fluorescent light, an image of someone who had long depended on the kindness of unexamined balances and now found receipts instead of favors. I did not gloat. I sat very still and checked boxes quietly because my task wasn't revenge for sport, it was neutralization. I wanted no more theft, no more access to a future I'd tried to build for Maya. Jason called, the voice calm and practical, and walked me through the filings he wanted on my desk within hours. Preservation letters to the banks, emergency subpoenas for the merchant accounts tied to those transaction IDs we had cataloged, and a motion to require an accounting of fiduciary access to the trust. He used the word forensic a lot, and he advised that we file in a jurisdiction that would hold evidence and not let it be dissipated while we pushed for an audit. Alan was already 2 steps ahead, arranging quiet outreach to investors who mattered. He called 3 major backers and let them know in the kind of low voice used by people who manage reputations for a living that risk optics had shifted and that they might want to reevaluate their exposure. By late afternoon, 2 institutional investors, a regional pension fund and a coastal private equity group, issued terse statements that froze promised lines of credit. Alan's network worked like a dam. One withdrawal created pressure and another investor pulled back, then another, and the flow that had once lubricated Cole's moves began to thicken. Cole started calling my numbers in the middle of all this, his tone thin with fury and the whine of entitlement. He left messages that were veiled threats wrapped in business terms, the kind of language men use when they think money buys immunity, innuendo about messing with people who can make trouble for you, hints at reputational damage if we took this public in the wrong way. I listened and let the calls go to voicemail because action had to be deliberate, not reflexive. I returned one short message that sounded almost submitted, neutral, and tired, because I wanted him to underestimate the coldness gathering behind the calm. It was a mask and a tool. As dusk settled, my phone lit up with Brittany's late-night calls. She was screaming into the line about blocked accounts and public exposure, about the humiliation of boutique clerks and investors pulling back. Her voice was raw and small with real fear. I spoke to her in a voice that had been measured like concrete, saying what must be said plainly because this was not about revenge for pleasure but about consequence for theft. I told her calm and clear, you taught her loyalty means nothing. Don't be surprised when she learned the lesson. My words were not triumph, they were a closing of a door I should have closed sooner. The night outside my study felt colder, but it felt also like protection being put in place, slow and deliberate as poured foundations. The rumor started like a pebble thrown into a perfectly still pond, and I heard it first through the hum of a country club kitchen where forks and laughter kept time together like a metronome. I was there under the pretense of a design charity table, leaning against a cool marble ledge while a woman 3 tables over let a sentence hang loud enough for others to pick up. Did you hear about those tax dodges tied to Cole's permits? Questionable arrangements, really. People glanced, smiled politely, and then the smiles thinned because once a seed like that is planted, social oxygen starts to disappear fast. I watched faces go through the small calculations we all make, association equals risk, and the white noise of the brunkroom swallowed the name like a tide. Brittany felt it immediately in the way invitations stopped arriving. She came to our house that afternoon, mascara smudged and eyes rimmed red, acting like someone who had been surprised by a gradual fall. I found her in our bathroom, holding herself to a mirror as if it would steady her, wiping at dark streaks under her eyes and calling it stress. The morning after, a salon appointment was canceled with a curt text. "Schedule changed, sorry." The text read like a small verdict. People do that first. They let their little conveniences go before they let reputations. It's practical cruelty. We staged the first round of what I call precise pressure without using spectacle. Vanessa Grant, who had been inside Brittany's circle for years and who used to call herself a friend, became the lever we needed. Vanessa started slipping small things after a call where I had offered her protection if she spoke honestly. She was afraid, not of us exactly, but of the way a public collapse would eat anything she'd built. She traded names, dates, the time of a dinner, a receipt that bore the boutique's logo, and login screenshots that matched the timestamps we already had. She wanted one thing I could give: the assurance that anyone who came forward would be handled with care and that her family would not be dragged into the mess if she cooperated. It was ugly bargaining and I felt ugly for it, but Vanessa's fear was real and useful. We fed small, verifiable pieces of evidence into the places that would make a difference. A charity board that Cole had spoken to last spring received a neat package with a photo timestamped IMG 20,250,311,184,830. JPG attached to a polite note asking for clarification. A local reporter received a brief email titled "Meridian Permits," questionable signatures with the specific permit numbers we'd traced. The items were chosen for their currency and their ability to make people in that sphere pause and ask uncomfortable questions. We never published anything wild or unverifiable. That would have made us bait. Instead, we opened up a space where people who relied on reputations had to make a choice to stay close or step away. There were staged run-ins that looked accidental but were anything but. At a grocery store, an old friend of Brittany's crossed the aisle, said a terse hello, and turned away. At a school event, a group of mothers clustered like a small fortress and left a clear empty chair where Brittany had expected to sit. Those moments felt petty and painful for her, small violences that accumulate, but they mattered because social ostracism is a slow force. People don't notice it until they are surrounded. It's not dramatic in itself, but in the arithmetic of ruin it's effective. Cole's partners began to shift too. A weekend industry piece that used to sing Meridian's praises ran with a cautious paragraph about recently raised concerns and quoted a neutral analyst who suggested reevaluation. Two board members on Cole's advisory panel issued statements that emphasized due diligence without mentioning names. The distancing was clinical and precise. It was the kind of thing that made the financial backers pause and advisors draft contingency letters. I watched those moves like someone watching a building being stripped of its external supports, and I felt none of the satisfaction people expect to find in a revenge story. There was only the clear arithmetic. Fewer allies meant fewer avenues for money, influence, and damage. Maya watched all of this with a quiet that unnerved me. She cataloged every slight and every rescinded RSVP in a folder titled Social Trace, noting who untagged her mother's photos and the exact times they did it. She de-learned to read social currency the way I read material stress. It revealed where pressure would do the most work. The isolation around Brittany and Cole tightened like a cord, and as it did I saw the path we had been working toward reveal itself. Isolation makes people desperate and predictable. It makes final moves possible. Maya looked at me across the kitchen light and smiled once, small and private, and I understood that the walls were closing in the way we had planned. Not for spectacle, but because the only thing that would protect her future was a clean perimeter. We chose the old Investors Club on Harbor Row because it smelled like Cole's vanity, heavy curtains, brass rails, a stage where he'd once toasted new towers, and because people who had backed him still remembered the room well. The decision was crisp and quiet. 3 days to prepare, a neutral moderator, coffee urns arranged to make it look like a routine briefing, and the projection screens hung where Cole used to put up glossy renderings. Jason, Alan, Maya, and I rehearsed every slide until our voices sounded like instruments, not instruments of vengeance. The venue filled with people who expected a soft conversation and got something else entirely. We laid out the evidence like a set of reinforced beams. Emails with subject lines and full headers. Screenshots showing IMG 20,250,412 220,456. JPG next to messages sent from Brittany's number. Bank transfer records with IDs ACH 72918304551 and trans 046582119 tied to merchant receipts. And inspection reports that match city permit numbers but bore signatures we proved were falsified. The projection screen illuminated each line with surgical brightness. Every date was visible, every timestamp exact. There was no thunder, no dramatic music, only the hush that comes when a room realizes information is no longer negotiable but factual. People leaned forward because facts are heavy and gravity is a useful thing. The stock ticker ran in a corner of the screen for anyone tracking the business impact in real time. I watched the numbers like someone watching a tide. When the first auditor's notes went public and our packets circulated, Matthew's development group shares dropped hard. By the time I reached the slide that matched withdrawals to hotel bookings and boutique charges, the feed showed a 21% intraday slump, 21% in plain red numerals that felt like a verdict on a company built on image. A murmur moved through the room like wind shaking old leaves. I went to the podium and asked Cole a single plain question that required nothing dramatic but everything precise. Can you account for the transfers linked to OC72918304451, and did you personally authorize any withdrawals from the Hayes Trust account? My voice was steady and flat because I had spent nights turning anger into architecture. He tried to laugh it off, the practiced smirk of a man who believed brand charm could cover messy facts. I clicked the remote and the next slide showed an email from his office confirming reservation codes that matched the bank transfers, and then a restaurant receipt with his name on it dated the same day. The room went quieter. Cole's face changed first. There was the small involuntary flicker of someone who realized charm had stopped being armor. He rose and began to speak in clipped sentences that became louder but less coherent, words that tried to turn the conversation into something personal and petty. Security moved in with polite hands and clipped professional efficiency. He was guided out before he could make a substantive denial, his protests dissolving into the hallway where his voice no longer carried authority. Brittany sat like someone watching a building she helped decorate collapse. When her phone lit with an incoming call, she let it go to speaker. The voice on the speaker was a boutique owner I'd never met. Her words came out in a choked mixture of anger and fear. You took from a child. You expect us to keep being your customers. It was a voice cracking because the person on the other end had real money and real standards, and the connection between theft and reputation had become painfully literal. You could hear someone immediately recalibrating relationships. Brittany's face folded into something honest and small. No more tricks, no more rehearsed indignation. The call played in the room like an unambiguous score. Jason walked me through the immediate fallout as facts detonated in public. The State Building Department opened an investigation within hours. A regulatory auditor had their packet, and two of Cole's largest investors issued statements that put distance between their names and his company. Alan had already begun quiet conversations with law enforcement contacts who confirmed they were watching the same packet. His grim efficiency made the room feel less like a stage and more like a courtroom. The press did what press does, they recorded, they asked, and they repeated the parts that fit the narrative of wrongdoing. After the crowd thinned and the screens dimmed, Maya stood with me in the empty part of the club where the curtains still smelled faintly of polished wood. She folded her hands the way she'd learned in school for moments of silence, like someone closing a book on a chapter. I felt the long arc of what we'd set in motion bending toward consequence, not for the sake of cruelty, but to secure a future that had been pilfered from a child. We did not celebrate. We allowed ourselves a single quiet breath, a small, steadying moment that felt like a foundation being poured. Justice, slow and precise, had begun to move. They came before dawn in a way that makes you understand how small normal life is when real power moves. I watched a live feed from my study as federal agents and state inspectors swarmed Cole Matthews, Riverside offices, badges glinting and clipboards underarms, while camera crews circled like vultures hungry for a narrative. Men in suits hauled out bankers' boxes stamped in black ink. Cardboard after cardboard carried contracts, invoices, and folder tabs that matched the ones we'd cataloged. On screen, a project manager I'd never met, Evan Cross, sat, looked tired, and then gave a statement that sounded like surrender. He agreed to speak with investigators and offer details that matched our timestamps, and the sight of those boxes moving out felt like a slow unbuilding of a whole practiced life. At home, the danger was closer and messier. Alan's security system pinged my phone at 2:17 a.m., motion at the gate. I snapped to the monitor and saw three strangers in dark jackets lingering near the side entrance, the kind of men you don't want near a house with a child in it. I shouted Maya's name as if my voice could cut through the night and heard her footsteps behind me, steady and quick, exactly as trained. We moved to the safe room I'd had built after the first threats, a small windowless place with a reinforced door and a line to the police. I called 911 and Alan's detail was already en route. They intercepted the intruders before the police arrived, holding them until questions could be asked. Jason filed emergency protective orders that afternoon to make sure nobody could approach us privately, and because of the earlier freezes and holds we'd placed, cash flowed nowhere. The accounts were locked, inaccessible, and that legal muscle kept potential threats from finding leverage. There are costs nobody writes about in the neat timeline of a successful case. I slept in fits, more like mechanical rests than real sleep, pages of deposit confirmations floating through my head. I spent long hours in the small hours scanning documents until the edges of fonts blurred and the room smelled forever of printer toner and coffee. There were private dinners with Maya where we ate slowly and talked about nothing and everything, folding the day into words that made sense to a child and to a man trying to be steady. Once, over microwave soup and a stupid movie, Maya said, "We did the right thing, Dad," and the sentence landed like a small coin of comfort in my palm. The personal cost was a kind of wear my face thinner, my patience tested, but the purpose was simple and pure, to defend her future. Vanessa Grant's fall arrived with ugly swiftness because truth usually does. She'd come to me frightened and half-right about her own exposure, and in exchange for immunity and careful handling she turned us documents showing her private texts with Brittany and receipts that proved she'd known more than friendship allowed. I released a tightly curated packet, messages that showed duplicity, timestamps that matched other evidence, and a short note explaining why we released them. Vanessa's reputation imploded, board invitations evaporated, charity committees sent polite regrets, and friends stopped answering. I felt the sting of making that choice even as I understood it. She had chosen a side for years where loyalty came with a price and the exposure protected Maya. It was necessary, not indulgent. Brittany tried to monetize ruin in the way people who don't feel shame sometimes do. She pitched a sob story to tabloids, hoping for sympathy, spin, and perhaps enough cash to paper over consequences. I'd kept recordings, though, conversations where she joked about excess and where her tone when discussing the transfers betrayed knowledge and intent. I released selected clips to editors along with the evidence dossier. The tabloids who once savored scandal turned cautious when presented with legal clarity and public records that would make them complicit in promoting theft from a child. Her pitches were rejected and her offers diminished. It wasn't mercy to stop the tabloids. It was a shield for Maya's life from being auctioned for clicks. When the raids finished, there were arrests. Cole was taken into custody on charges tied to fraud and falsified records after agents found several supporting documents in those cardboard boxes. One of his key associates agreed to cooperate and gave testimony that lined up with Evan Cross's earlier statements. The developer who'd once moved quickly through beachfront ribbon cuttings now sat in a cell where influence meant nothing. Watching his name on a court docket felt less like victory than like maintenance. A building finally being condemned because its supports had been rotten for years. I won't pretend the wounds didn't leave marks. There are nights when the quiet in the house presses like a hand, when I find myself checking locks twice and waking to the echo of camera pings. People say retribution heals, but it doesn't erase. It reshapes what's possible. Maya's laughter returned in short, sharp bursts, and we planted a small maple in the yard to mark the end of a hard season. I stood in my workshop a week later, hands on a fresh model, and looked at that tiny house like an oath. Retribution had done what I needed it to do. It put distance between a child's future and the greed that tried to claim it. But it also left scars I will carry, quietly and carefully, like a rebuilt beam in a house that will have to hold more than it was meant to. The aftermath moved like legal machinery. Indictments filed within weeks, a press release noting charges that could carry up to 5 years for major fraud and falsified records, and a cascade of court dates that filled my calendar like small, unavoidable stones. Boutiques we'd flagged, Marlowe & Co., Luna Atelier, Isla Rue, faced audits that made their owners nervous, and Brittany began answering tax questions that were no longer casual. Cole faced criminal charges that once would have been quietly negotiated. Instead, his name sat on filings and public dockets, and people who'd smiled at his ribbon cuttings now kept their distance. The social exile we'd engineered was slow and precise, and every lost invitation or withdrawn endorsement became a small, practical consequence. Within 72 hours, I got the trust moved into the legal vehicle Jason had recommended. The transfer cleared on the third morning with a professional fiduciary listed and a 2-signature rule that would make misdirection impossible. The trustees we chose were boring and competent, and that was exactly what I wanted. I opened the Hayes Harbor Scholarship, a small fund seeded with a portion of what we could reclaim and designed to help kids from broken households afford tutoring and summer programs. And I set up protocols no one could bend. Encrypted backups, a named legal guardian, account audits twice a year, and an independent review board to check spending. Security protocols became part of daily life. tighter sign-ins, a safe room we kept ready, and an electronic monitoring system tied to a private line for emergencies. Court hearings felt less like spectacle and more like enforcement. Modest rooms, wooden benches, clerks with tired eyes, and lawyers doing the slow, necessary work of putting paper where it matters. I sat in one of those hearings with Maya beside me, her knees barely touching the seat in front. After the judge set a preliminary date and the prosecutor nodded at a stack of evidence, we walked out into a pale afternoon and went to a new studio I'd rented for her music practice. Over dinner in a small place with good light and cheap pasta, she told me she wanted to study sound engineering and maybe music production in college. And she laughed once at an offhand joke that was entirely her own. She told me quietly that during the fight she'd felt both terrified and oddly powerful, terrified because adults can break things in ways kids can't fix, powerful because she had helped stop it. There were collateral consequences I hadn't wanted but had accepted as necessary. Vanessa Grant's name did not survive exposure, her invitations ceased, and the board she'd leaned on evaporated. I had given journalists the documents that showed her duplicity, and watching the social calculus unfold felt like holding a bittersweet tool. Brittany tried the tabloids and got turned away when audio and bank records made her version of the story impossible to sell. I kept thinking about the ethical line we'd crossed. We used other people's fear to leverage truth, and we released private messages to protect a child's future. Those choices followed me into my shop at night like small shadows. I think about the alliances I used a lot. Jason's legal comm, Alan's networks, Vanessa's last-minute cooperation, they were the beams that held up what we built. I also think about privacy given up. Evidence had to be public enough to matter, and that made parts of our life open to strangers. The method was surgical and legal, but it was also invasive. I walked that line because I believed the ends were about protecting a child's safety, not punishing for joy. If the question was blunt, would I do it again for Maya? My answer would be immediate and without moral hesitation. Yes, because the choice was between a stolen future and standing guard. On a late afternoon, when the house leaned into dusk and the windows glowed warm, I hung a small family photograph on the study wall. Maya in a sun hat at the coast, her grin bright and honest, and a grainy shot of me a little older, a little more tired, holding a model of a house I'd just finished. I stepped back while the light thinned, looking at a fortified home that smelled like cedar, toner, and fresh paint, a place that had been protected at a cost. The camera that might have once wanted scandal would find only a quiet house now, walls that had been reinforced, and a life that had been steadied. Betrayal won't be tolerated here, and loyalty will be taught and defended across generations.